This is Gina Anderson Cohen, and I am here with Erin Conroy, who is the owner of Westtown PT and a physical therapist who specializes in pelvic floor therapy and recovery. Erin, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I was so excited to get you on this episode. I know you've talked to the Sweat Life community in the past about the pelvic floor, about taking care of the pelvic floor. So talk to me about why it matters so much.
Well, it matters because the pelvic floor is, it's the base of your core. It's involved in pretty much everything. The pelvic floor, has control in your bowel and bladder. It supports your organs. It's for sexual function, but also it's like overall in general, it's the base of your core. It sits at the bottom of your pelvis. And then you have, your abdominal muscles like your transversus abdominis, occipitae, and then those larger muscles that sit over it, and then your diaphragm at the top. But they function in pretty much everything you do in life. So it's very important in general. And then obviously like things like during pregnancy and stuff, there's a greater role for it.
Yeah, and that's what a lot of women start talking about the pelvic floor is in pregnancy. So what are kind of the changes that happen both while you're pregnant and postpartum to the pelvic floor?
Yeah. So while you're pregnant, if you think about like there's this growing baby, your uterus is bigger, there's so much more pressure going down on your pelvic floor. Your pelvic floor becomes a little more lengthened. So that makes it harder to recruit it properly. Your posture also changes. So that makes it, the way you recruit your muscles becomes a little bit different. And then just like I said before, your pelvic floor doesn't function alone. As your stomach is expanding, muscles like your transversus abdominis are becoming longer, making it harder to recruit that as well in combination with your pelvic floor. So, definitely one of the major changes during pregnancy. And then there are just other things that can happen during pregnancy too, as a reaction to that change. Like people can tighten up in their pelvic floor, or it can lead to leaking, like, the whole pees thing, if you like sneeze and pee, just because of that increased pressure down on the pelvic floor.
Yeah, I know the first time I was really exposed to a group of women talking about sneezing and peeing or jumping and peeing was this group of moms I used to train when I led a boot camp. They were incredible, but whenever I would try to make them do jumping jacks, half of them would be like, nope.
Yeah, that's something that's just so common postpartum. And a lot of times people just accept that as it's just, I just had a baby, that's how it is. But it doesn't need to be that way. You can fix that. You can rehab it and kind of get back to doing all the things that you want to do.
Yeah. And as we're thinking through like the reasons to go through pelvic floor therapy, especially postpartum, again, we're in this month talking about babies. There are a couple of topics that you and I spoke about before, including prolapse, diastasis, and just painful sex in general. If one doesn't go through the recovery process, when are most people seeing those symptoms? Right away or a few months after baby?
So a lot of times people will notice it right away, but in those first few weeks, like there's a lot of things going on. Like you're bleeding, you're trying to get sleep, you're trying to raise a baby. So it's like, it's harder to notice, but then as things go on and people start getting back to activity, that's when they really start to notice that maybe things just aren't healing as well as they thought they would. Or a lot of times what I hear is after their 6-week checkup with their OB where they're cleared for activity, they'll just go out and go for a run and then be like, oh God, I feel like things are heavy down there, or they're falling out, or things just don't feel the same. Or they might go and try and have sex and realize it's painful. And it's one of those things where it's not until you kind of test the waters where you really notice, but it's so common and just not, I think there's this expectation that at 6 weeks you should be recovered, but it's usually around that point when they're cleared that people start noticing they're not back to normal. And you shouldn't be back to normal at 6 weeks. That's like a crazy short amount of time for your body to heal after this extensive period of time where things were changed. And like, whether you had a C-section or a vaginal birth, it's a huge trauma to the body. But 6 weeks is almost like that starting point of recovery rather than where you feel like you should be back to normal.
Yeah. And a lot of times women feel like they have to accept these. We talked about that a little bit before. Why is that? Why do we as women often think that this is just life now?
I think it's honestly just because that's what we've been told to kind of accept. And I think there is this lack of awareness too of like the rehab potential you can have for your body. But for the longest time, I just think you go to your 6-week checkup and, OBs are wonderful and trained in all the stuff I'm not. And, I'm trained more in that musculoskeletal side. So it's understandable that that's not their first instinct to kind of assess how they're functioning and everything. But I think it's just been the norm of checking like, okay, structurally, everything looks okay. You can go back. So hearing it from your doctor that everything's fine, you kind of just assume everything's fine. So it's just, we've kind of accepted that. And I think it's also just because pelvic floor, things like sex or peeing your pants and things like that are not something you just openly are talking about all the time. So you hear that that's just, oh, I've had a baby, that's what happens. And you accept it because you aren't openly having these conversations. But now I think with social media and just people being a little more open in general, it's becoming a little more of there's more awareness around it, that you don't have to accept it's common, but it doesn't need to be normal.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get into what pelvic floor therapy actually is. Is it just laying on the floor doing Kegels?
No. And I think pelvic floor therapy, it sounds kind of scary, but it's really orthopedic physical therapy. It's similar to if you were to go to physical therapy for your knee, or however, it does usually include, if it's warranted, an internal assessment of your pelvic floor muscles. During pregnancy, a lot of times we don't do internal. If there's something that warrants it, we will. But postpartum, you have your pelvic floor is made of 3 different layers of muscles. There's like 11 little muscles all in there. We need to be able to see and feel what they're doing to know exactly how they're functioning, just like we would need to look at another muscle elsewhere. But because they're internal, it sounds a little scarier, but it's just like if you were to go to the OB, they use a speculum. We just use our finger to assess like the tissue integrity, like if you have any scar tissue from tearing. We'll assess the different layers of the muscles of like strength, power, endurance, just like you would other muscles. And then we look at it as how it's functioning with the rest of the core. So yes, there is a place for Kegels, just to get an idea of like how it's engaging, but we usually look at how you're managing your pressure with that. So with breathing, and then in combination with your deep abdominal muscles, we always do a full body assessment too. So even like something like your foot can affect your pelvic floor. So we'll look at like how you're walking, how you're squatting. We'll look at your hip muscles because your hip muscles provide support to your pelvic floor. So very rarely, you shouldn't, if you're going to pelvic floor therapy and you're spending your entire time on the table on your back doing your Kegels and you're not progressing, I would question why you're not progressing. And that's like, if you're not moving beyond the table, that's an issue. So in the beginning, we might initially start with something like laying on your back, just working on that engagement, but we want to quickly transition to doing things a little more functionally, like squatting, rehabbing your core in combination with your pelvic floor. And the main thing is really just learning how to use your pelvic floor with the rest of the activities, like deadlifts for like hinging to lift your baby out of the crib, or even just returning to running and things like that. So just because you know how to do a Kegel laying down doesn't mean it's going to transition to those other activities. So in pelvic floor therapy, we will look at your pelvic floor, do internal if we need, we'll do any soft tissue mobilization if we need, or work at desensitizing the area, but we will quickly transition to doing more of what looks like traditional physical therapy, of doing it with more like full body exercises.
That's such a good overview too, because I know it can sound kind of scary. It's just, I like that explanation of it's just like rehabbing knee, because it's never just the knee. The knee might hurt, but all the muscles around it might need work, and you might need to work on stabilization and all of that other fun stuff that goes with it.
Exactly.
All right, let's talk about insurance. So when I hear about pelvic floor therapy, my first, it sounds like a luxury because it feels so new. Is it covered by insurance?
Yes. And I think it's a common misconception that it's not covered by insurance, but the reality is they're muscles. It's an orthopedic treatment. So if you are covered for orthopedic pelvic therapy, you can be covered for pelvic floor therapy. It really depends on, what we code it as is what we see looking at your pelvic floor, but everything we're looking at is orthopedic. So it can be covered by insurance.
Awesome. Okay. The one thing that you said blew my mind last time we chatted, Erin, was about leveraging pelvic floor therapy and exercises for easier labor and delivery. You see a lot of people while they're pregnant. Can you talk about how this helps during pregnancy and during delivery?
Yeah, so I would definitely recommend anyone who's pregnant to come into pelvic floor therapy before the whole postpartum journey, because it can really help with preventing issues and also helping with an easier labor. So some things we'll work on during pregnancy is managing your pressure correctly, but also learning how to use your full range of your pelvic floor. So of course, like during pregnancy, like aches and pains, like that's something we 100% treat. I feel like that's not something that needs a ton of explanation, but we'll do things like birth prep. So going through like how to relax your pelvic floor, because when you are pushing a baby out, it's a common misconception that you need a really strong pelvic floor to push your baby out. That is not true. You need a nice, strong, flexible pelvic floor while you're pregnant, postpartum, but when you're actually pushing the baby out, you need your pelvic floor just to get out of the way and let your uterus and like the pressure do its job to push the baby out. So we do a lot of working on learning how to open the pelvic floor and let go. And there are also different things like positioning. So it's standard pretty much when you give birth that they'll just have you on your back and you push, but there are other options that can actually help open your pelvis more. So like a slide lying position, or on your hands and knees. And even with an epidural, a lot of times you can get into that hands and knees position. Without an epidural, you can do a lot of different positions. It's something that you just need to be open with your provider about, because sometimes there's resistance, because I think it is easier on the provider if you are on your back. Also, there's no wrong way to push with positioning. It's what feels best for you in the moment, but they're like with knees and ankles out, that helps open your pelvic outlet. And there's also different ways you can breathe to help with reducing tearing and just helping with the efficiency of pushing and getting better oxygen as you push, rather than just like holding your breath. There's what's called open goddess pushing, where you can slowly exhale as you push. There's no wrong way. It's just like what feels right for you, but there are ways to make your process a little bit easier, and just little educational pieces about like timing and things like that. And then like a lot of stuff we work on, it can help you with that postpartum recovery, especially in that first 6 weeks. So you don't have to just lay around for 6 weeks. Well, obviously you're not laying around, you're caring for a baby. But I mean, you can start to do some things on your own to start kind of rehabbing the pelvic floor and core. And a lot of what we do prenatally, it helps your brain remembers like how to do all these things in kind of that gentle rehab process. But yeah, it's just a lot of that whole birth prep is a lot more of educational stuff, but it can really be helpful with, instead of just going in blind to pushing a baby out.
Yeah. And what's fun, as we're having this conversation, you're 20 some weeks along.
I'll be 25. Yes, I'm 24 and a half. Yeah.
So, I mean, you're not only a client, you're also a practitioner of this. What are you sort of looking forward to with baby and with this whole journey?
It's been really interesting because this is my first baby, but I've been doing pelvic floor therapy for a while. So it really is interesting being on the other side of things, and putting myself making myself be a good patient, and I've been managing to keep myself pretty much pain-free. But I will say it is pretty eye-opening to think of some of the things like I give as advice and that I don't spend enough time on, because now I realize how much more effort it takes. Like even little things like rolling to my side and getting out of bed is really, like, it's easier said than done because it's just habit, everything like that. But I honestly am finding this journey kind of fascinating, because I love that I have this knowledge kind of with it. So yeah, I'm looking forward. I feel like a nerd, but I'm like obviously looking forward to most part having a baby, but yeah. I'm looking forward to like putting everything to the test. Like, okay, this is working. I haven't had any low back pain. We're good. So it's making me a very much more big believer in our profession. But yeah, I'm looking forward to the whole journey, but most importantly, having a baby.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Meeting that little stranger growing inside of you.
Yeah.
Okay, let's close it out with the big important question. Everyone wants to know, like, when am I going to be back? 6 weeks I'm cleared, but when am I actually back when it comes to pelvic floor? What's your answer for that?
My answer would be it's definitely individualized for each person, but recovering can take like up to a year. So I think if you go in with the expectation you are not going to be feeling back to yourself, and you might be back to a different self, and it's not, your body is going to be forever changed, but you can feel back to a good normal and good version of yourself. But give yourself a year grace. Like if you want to start working on it right away, but just know 6 weeks is your starting point, not your end point. So give yourself grace, and that way you have the expectation ahead of time, so you're not freaking out when things aren't quite what you feel like they should be.
Erin, amazing shameless plug. Tell us where to find you and where to follow you.
Yeah, so westtownpt.com. We have 2 locations. One is over at Chicago and Ashland in Westtown, and then we have Westtown at Roscoe Village, which is where we do all of our pelvic floor and perinatal care. That one is at 1900 West Belmont. You can book online really easily. And then I've been horrible with social media, but I'm going to be better since I am currently pregnant. I'll start posting I think it's a good time to start posting some helpful things. So it's Erin, ERINC_DPT for Instagram.
Erin, thank you so much for joining me. This has been incredibly educational.
Well, thank you for having me. This has been fun.